can officially go. Oh, there we go. Okay, so hello everybody. Happy Independence Day. Hopefully everyone can hear me still. If you can't, please say something. So for the topic today, this is kind of a long-winded, meandering way of getting to this topic, but I'll skip all that part and tell you how it attaches into what we spoke about last time. So last time we spoke a little bit about some of the laws of Avelos, some of the laws of mourning, and we quoted Rabbi Yekutiel Yehuda Greenwald, who is the rabbi in Columbus, and his book Ach L'Tzara. Ach L'Tzara was a compilation of laws on Avelos and specifically geared towards the American scene. It should be noted that this was actually one of the first, perhaps the first book of this genre, where you have an entire book dedicated to one element of halacha. And Rev Greenwald then wrote a second version of this, which was called Kol Bal al Avelos, which has been a classic since the time he wrote it. Rev Greenwald, again, as I mentioned, was a rabbi in Columbus. He was born in Sighet in Hungary in 1889, coming to the United States and to Columbus in 1924, where he stayed for the rest of his life. He was a great defender of the Hungarian rabbinate in which he was raised. On the one hand, this may be surprising. Rev Greenwald himself, actually, even from the time he was a teenager, was a great Zionist and remained so his entire life. He actually went to study then in Germany, and while he was in Germany, he took classes at the local university. In Columbus, he gave lectures on topics such as George Washington and the Jews. He participated in debate about whether the Merchant of Venice was a anti-Semitic screed or not. Seemingly decidedly, much to the angst of his father, who was a more typical Hungarian rabbi, Rabbi Greenwald demonstrated all of these, what one might say, non-Hungarian characteristics and ideas. Nonetheless, he was a great defender of his homeland and of the rabbis there. And he wrote explicitly against modern orthodoxy. I'll read for you a couple of points that he makes here. He says, I myself have heard a speaker who is known by the title rabbi, that when eulogizing before the deceased, spoke of the greatness of the Russian author Tolstoy. Once upon a time, the children of Israel knew well that those who act in this way were called freethinkers or the deviants of Israel, reformers who have no place amongst the kosher Israelites. Today, however, they speak in the name of modern orthodoxy, in emphasis. And the rabbi is modern orthodox, which means he has the right to change, limit, or add as times demand, as long as he is called orthodox. And furthermore, he says, modern orthodoxy is a plague that does not appear in the Bible. They destroy all that is holy to us. On Sabbath evening, they gather in the synagogue, arriving in automobiles. They park on all of the surrounding streets. The entire congregation sings tunes, women and men together. Young ladies and women chant in front of the Holy Ark, and the modern Orthodox rabbi babbles about Spinoza, Schopenhauer, and other such friends. This is their Sabbath evening worship of God, and they throw their spears on all who try to speak out against them. They eat their meals anywhere, and even in the homes of women who desecrate the Sabbath in public. They also belittle the adultery laws, and without proper investigation and testimony, they declare a woman to be eligible for marriage. So Rev Greenwald is seemingly idiosyncratic at best, and on the one hand, defending his homeland of Hungary and the rabbis there, as we'll see today, speaking out very strongly against what he termed the modern orthodoxy, while in fact that label could very well be applied to him, one who went to university, who speaks about Shakespeare and the like. And so that is Rabbi Greenwald, and again, but he was a great Rav, an author of many books, including the ones that I mentioned, but also books on Jewish history, and really someone to look towards as a great American rabbi pre-World War II. So Rabbi Greenwald is the first of the protagonists in our story today. The second one is one perhaps for those who have been coming to class for a while may remember our good friend Rav Chayyim Hirschenson. So Rav Hirschenson was the rabbi in Hoboken, New Jersey, right near where we are today, and he actually was born in Sfas and grew up in Yerushalayim. He got entangled with the Hungarian rabbinate simply because they excommunicated him. Rav Hirschenson had definitely modern ideas. For example, he collaborated with Eliezer ben Yehuda and believed strongly in the expansion of the Hebrew language. He also believed that that the Jews in Jerusalem and surrounding areas should actually work rather than relying on the tzedakah of the gullus of Jews in exile. Hirschenson also wrote many svarim. His Shalos Yeshuvos are here called Sefer Malki Bakodesh. They are in many ways atypical in terms of their response. I don't know if you see me, but if you see me, I'm holding this up. In some ways, they're atypical in a sense that they don't answer questions like, is this woman considered an aguna, or is this get kosher? They deal with what he calls questions of the nation. How do we set up a modern homeland in the land of Israel? What do we do with the holy mount, the Temple Mount, in a Jewish state? How does a Jewish state set up a court system that includes modern understanding of judicial systems? All of these are the questions that he deals with in Malki Bakodesh, and perhaps not surprisingly, given his personality, he is probably the only rabbi to write 3 entire volumes on the Maseches of Chorios, which talks about mistakes when a court system, or when the Kohen Gadol, when the high priest makes a mistake on Jewish law, what is done. One thing that you can certainly rely on about Rav Hirschenson was, if you write him a letter, it will likely show up in his next book with his answer. So you have to be careful about writing to him, because it will be publicized very soon. And we actually see Rabbanim commenting to each other about this danger in writing to Rav Hirschenson. Nonetheless, Rav Hirschenson again was a great individual, certainly a very modern one who believed that society was generally going in a positive direction, and that Judaism per se could not contradict any proper evolution, any proper evolution of modern society. And therefore, this the sefer, this just held up by Malki Bakodesh, was printed by Machon Shechter, which is a shame, not because they publish it, which is wonderful, but it suggests almost that people consider him conservative as opposed to Orthodox, which is completely again, depending on how we're going to define conservative Judaism versus Orthodox Judaism. But as we'll see today, Rav Hirschenson himself speaks out strongly against conservative Judaism, and is certainly in the Orthodox camp. So those are our protagonists for today, and the reason why our protagonists are intertwined within this class is because of the following situation. Rav Hirschenson was a good 30 years older than Rav Greenwald. Rav Hirschenson was born in 1857. Rav Greenwald was born in 1889. As I mentioned, Rav Hirschenson was born in Sfas, and Rav Greenwald was born in Sighet. And the Torah journal called Appropriateness, which was published by Rabbi Shmuel Miller, who was himself a Hungarian rabbi, as we'll see in a little bit, decided that they were going to dedicate a volume of the journal to Rav Hirschenson. And so if we're looking at the sources, so the first source is the journal Appropriateness. On HebrewBooks.org, if anybody is interested, you can find most of the individual issues of that year, plus the compilation of all the issues into one book. So that's the one that I'm using. Again, it's called Appropriateness Kovitz Lidrosh Ulinyanei Yisrael Saba, and this is from Tafresh Peches from 1928. And he says right in the beginning, Hagilyon Hazem Muktar Mugash B'Chavod V'Yakar LeHarav Chayyim Hirschenson Av Bezdin B'Hoboken V'Hasaviva. So this volume is dedicated to the great Rabbi Rav Chayyim Hirschenson, who is the rabbi in Hoboken and its surrounding areas. Okay, so that is a wonderful thing to do. It's again the 70th birthday of Rav Hirschenson, and that's why they made this dedication. And Rav Hirschenson, in thanking the editor and the contributors to this issue, writes as follows in the next source. Haumnam, he says, however, lo yadati eich noda lahem hadavar asher gam mishpachti uvnei meisi lo yadu. I don't know how you guys figured out that I was 70 years old. In fact, he says, I'll tell you the truth. I'm actually also not sure what year I was born, which is a very interesting statement. And he goes on to give a whole explanation as to why he doesn't know exactly what year he was born. He says he remembers his bar mitzvah, a great rabbi coming to him and giving him a bracha, but he doesn't remember exactly, because it happened near the time of, I guess I should have looked this out. It was near the time of a Birchas Achama, the 28-year cycle of the sun that we record. So he says he knows it was around there, but he doesn't remember whether it was before or whether it was after. So he himself he's figuring out, like, how in the world did you guys know that I was 70 years old? In fact, I myself don't know. I should note, I apologize, I should have mentioned this earlier. There's an excellent article on this discussion that we're going to have between Rav Hirschenson and Rev Greenwald from Adam Furtziger. It was published in the Jewish Quarterly Review in 2015, so I'm holding it up if you can see me. The PDF is readily found online, but I'm happy to forward it to anybody who might be interested. So he says, like, how in the world do you guys know that I was 70 years old? So Rabbi Yekutiel Yehuda Greenwald then writes in, and he says, in the next source number 3. Oh, maybe, I guess if you can see, I'll try to. There it is. El kavod harafa gon hachacham upursam oser Torah v'achachma, to the great rabbi, and so on and so forth, for Chayyim Hirschenson, right? Hashem Yechazik Kochol V'Chelau V'Yafutz Ma'anasav Chutzav Yizka. Okay, so he has all these wonderful titles, and he calls him, and he gives him all these blessings, and then he says, "V'Kariya Yomes Amaro Hanichbad B'Shem Toda Limechabdin Nanai B'Goyin Harvi Apriyon." So I was reading what you wrote. It says Rav Greenwald is publishing this again in Apriyon, but he's addressing it to Rav Hirschenson. So he says, "I read what you wrote. Easy Shayla, so you asked me, I know the Lahem Hadavar, Yom right? How did you know what year I was born?" So he says, well, I have a very good answer for you. Miller, right? As Yom Holed Shelo. How do you know my birthday? So he said, I'm going to tell you this great secret. I wrote to the editor of the journal. I wrote to Rav Shmuel Miller. Sorry, I'm like losing place here. That I suggested that we should dedicate a volume of the journal to Rav Hirschenson, because we need to demonstrate to the world that we appreciate everything that Rav Hirschenson has done. So sorry, didn't do that. He said, I looked into this book, Yisrael. I saw what year and what day Rav Hirschenson, you were born, and that's why I made this suggestion to this our good friend Rav Shmuel Miller, the editor of Apirion, to dedicate a volume of the journal. Okay, so we've solved the mystery. There's only one problem. Then all the contributions to the journal, one rabbi didn't contribute. Who was it? Rav Greenwald. So you can ask the question, like I said, Rav Greenwald asked this on himself. Right? So me, right, who was the first one to suggest to our good friend that we should dedicate a volume to Rav Hirschenson. So how come I didn't contribute anything? Right? It doesn't seem to make any sense. So in this letter, I'm going to explain to you why I didn't. Okay. And Rav Greenwald then quotes 2 places in which he feels Rav Hirschenson has gone too far in rebuking and speaking negatively about the Hungarian rabbinate. Okay, and he says, how could I take part in this, right, when I myself am from Hungarian of Hungarian origin? How could you speak negatively against my teachers and my rabbanim and my community? Am I one of those people too? And that's why I didn't write an article. Okay, so then we're going to see exactly what he wrote and what Rav Chayyim Hirschenson wrote that got Rav Greenwald so upset. But we should note, I'll just kind of give the end at the beginning. This in no way seems to have damaged the personal relationship between Rav Hirschenson and Rav Greenwald. Rav Greenwald in his book, it's called, oh, I didn't open it here, Pri Nachmad. He has at the end of his sefer, he has a number of letters written by Rabbanim to him, and he includes 2 letters of Rav Hirschenson, and this was written much later in Rav Greenwald's life. Certainly, if Rav Greenwald did not strongly disagree or in any way thought badly of Rav Hirschenson, he wouldn't have included any of Rav Hirschenson's letters in his own sefer, and in the letters, which again are published, Rav Hirschenson has only wonderful titles and great praise, signing off as a good friend and one who hopes for Rav Greenwald's best. So we should note that despite this argument that we'll see, Rav Hirschenson and Rav Greenwald themselves seem to have had a constructive and positive relationship. Okay, so what was it that Rav Hirschenson wrote that got Rav Greenwald so upset? So there are two points that he quotes. The first is in the second volume of Rav Hirschenson's writings on Maseches Horios. And as I mentioned, if you wrote a letter to Rav Hirschenson, you had to assume that would be published in his next book. And in fact, there was a person who wrote a letter to Rav Hirschenson, and it was very impolitely worded. It was really very much an attack as opposed to a question. It was almost an inquisition. And Rav Hirschenson writes at the beginning of his reply, listen, to such an attack, I have no responsibility to respond, right? At the minimum, you have to be polite, and you have to write you have to write in a polite way, and then you get an answer. But if you write like you're attacking, then you don't get an answer. He says, however, I see by the questions that you've asked me that you must be a great Talmid Chacham. You must be a wise individual, someone who knows Torah, and therefore I'm going to assume that you wrote the letter. You were upset. Something may have happened. You were upset about what I wrote, and therefore you wrote in this way. But I'm sure that by nightfall, after you wrote this letter, you did tshuva and you understood your mistake in writing badly, and therefore I'm going to respond to you. And then, but he says further, Olazos basi. This is now the next source. Olazos basi la shiva avishon rishon. So therefore, I'm going to answer all of your questions first things first. Ach bereishis anelo amasha mishtomemu mispalei asherav orthodoxy yichtov sefer kazeh. Says first, though, you wrote in your letter, right? Again, to this respondent, you wrote in your letter, how could it be that an Orthodox rabbi should write such a book? Doesn't make sense. Why? So he says, I understand. It seems that you're questioning why an Orthodox rabbi would write a commentary on Maseches Horios, on both the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, and the Jerusalem Talmud. So tzarich lichtov rak reformi. Right? What, only a reform rabbi should write this? So like the truth is, obviously that's not what the questioner wanted. The questioner was like, how can you write a sefer like this that included the words that I don't like in your sefer? Okay, but Rav Hirschenson is purposely misreading the question here. Still, amnam emesagid. However, I'll tell you this truth. Can you lo rav reformi? I'm not a reform rabbi. V'gam lo orthodoxy. I'm also not an Orthodox rabbi. Okay, what does that mean? I'm not an Orthodox rabbi. Rak rav shomer Torah mitzvos. I'm a rabbi who guards Torah and the commandments, apidas chazal, based on the words of our sages, the poskim, our rishonim, achronim, and the great halachic decisors, the earlier ones and the later ones. And then he says, this is the part that Rav Greenwald doesn't like, v'tzara gedola heviu chachmei Hungaria a Yisrael. And the wise men of Hungary brought great trouble on the Jewish people, b'shtei hashemos ha'ela, by using these two names, right? Orthodox and Reform. So those formulations are negative formulations and have caused much trouble, right? Why? Asher enam me'elu shemos b'nei Yisrael, right? These are not Jewish names. When makor zar motzam, they come from outside of Judaism, right? They come from non-Jews. Asher samu shmos ba'aretz, they are the ones who put these names into our colloquial speech, right? Imshe kavanas rabbane Hungaria hayisa l'shem shemayim. And even though it's true that the Hungarians' rabbi only had in mind to do things for the sake of God, they were doing things in the best they could. Still, lo shimshu b'shemos ivrim. They didn't use proper Jewish names. For example, what should they have used? Shomrei Torah. Right? They should have used those who guard Torah, umafirei Torah, and those who erase Torah. Those would have been proper names. Right? B'makom Orthodox reformi. That should replace Orthodox and Reform. As I believe, and if that were the case, if that formulation was done, then there's no doubt that those who guard Torah, they would have been successful. Because Jews would never go with a group that was called those who erase Torah. They would always follow the Jews. They would always follow those who established the Torah, right? Who believed in the Torah. And so the Rav Chayyim Hirschenson is suggesting that the title Orthodox and Reform, or the titles Orthodox and Reform, are they themselves they're I don't want to say they're ambiguous, but they're not focused, right? Reform implies that somehow you're doing something new and something okay, so you can push whatever you want under that sort of title. If the Orthodox Jews, what we call Orthodox Jews, had used the title for the Reform, those who erase Torah, then no Jews would have ever followed them. right? And that should have been what they used. So how could the Hungarian rabbis use these new formulations? Okay, so Greenwald's very upset about this particular statement. So that's statement number one. Statement number two that Rav Greenwald doesn't like goes as follows. This is in Malki Bakodesh. This is in the fourth volume, and he says as follows: B'dvar hamatzav mi inyanei Eretz Yisrael asher modia ksav rabbanom mechtavo. So this is a letter that Rav Hirschenson is responding to from Rav oh my goodness, I'm blanking on the name. Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank. Okay, who has not at that, but it doesn't seem at that point, but eventually became the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. Again, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank was a great rabbi, an excellent and important posek who wrote on again a wide range of topics and was again much revered by the Jewish people. And so Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank writes to Rav Hirschenson, who he knows grew up in Israel, right? Rav Hirschenson didn't come to the United States until, I don't remember the exact year, but Rav Hirschenson was in his 40s, I believe, when he came to the United States. So it wasn't like he left Israel when he was a teenager, right? Rav Hirschenson knew the Jewish scene in the Holy Land, and so he writes. Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank writes about some of the troubles that he's been facing with the various different factions in Jerusalem. So he says, he says, this is a very painful subject that you're bringing up, but unfortunately, it's not new. Right? Because the moment the Hungarians came into Israel, this Rabbi Hamachlokas Vapirud, so that increased greatly arguments and divisions. Even though it is true that they have actual, authentic, great people and righteous people amongst the Hungarians, but they have a national sickness. That to the pain of our hearts, that any people, any Jews who live in Galus, who live in exile, they are, as it were, they attach themselves to the outside, to the society outside of them, and they take on some of their characteristics, not all of which are positive. Unfortunately, many of which are negative, right? And that's what happened in Hungary. And the sickness amongst the Hungarians from always, is this divisiveness that is never sewn back together. That's impossible. And he goes on. And he talks about it's not, it's there's so many different peoples that make up Hungary and that area of Germany. If you go down to Hungary and then the former Yugoslavia and Bosnia and Herzegovina and Macedonia and all the countries, so there are lots of different people from many different religions, from many different races. There are all sorts of things, and so there's all this divisiveness in the country of Hungary, and that has stuck to our Jewish brethren as well. So what happens? They break up into these groups, and it's true that in the middle of this group, in the center, there's this Shoshana Halyana. There's greatness. There are wonderful people. They're great Torah scholars and tzaddikim. However, they're surrounded by chochim v'kotzim. They're surrounded by thorns and thistles. The hema azei panim shebedor, and they are brazen. V'kapos habochashos hamigisim b'kadira shebisha baravim. They're the ones who stir the pot. Umevim dal torim l'talmidei chacham ha'maisim shebahem, and they bring terrible accusations against talmidei chachamim. V'yichud yesh gam b'talmidei chacham shebahem achshava. They also have this thought process that they've inherited from the split amongst their peoples. It says even amongst the Talmidei Chacham of Hungary, there are those who believe that they are the only Talmidei Chachamim, that they're the only ones who actually understand Torah, and nobody else is any good. It says this is a terrible thing that the Hungarian rabbis and the Hungarian community have brought upon us and has spread to Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so that is the second statement of Rav Hirschenson that Rav Greenwald speaks against. Okay, and therefore he says in the next source, he says basically, I don't understand you. Rav Hirschenson says, he says Yislach li, right? Right, so your pen slipped clearly. right? That's what you say when you don't understand what somebody wrote. So and we know, we've seen this. Right? Rav Hirschenson was a great, was a great unifier. He looked at the Jews around him, who were unfortunately all too often ones who desecrated Shabbos and did other things that were not in line with Jewish law. And he tried to, he always thought the best of them. He always spoke out in defense of them. He talked about the fact that, they had no other way to support themselves, that this was the only thing that they could do. They had no way to support their families. And so Greenwald properly says, I don't understand your Hirschenson. You defend at all costs Jews who don't keep the Torah, and you speak so ill of Hungarians. Like how come? Like why do you do that? Okay, so he says, he says the great rabbis of Hungary who saved their peoples from the reform, lahem lo matzah zechus. You didn't find any merit for them. You've decided that they are the ones who've brought terrible trouble on Bnei Yisrael. Okay, so this is the statement of Rav Greenwald, and that's why he says he didn't write anything in dedication of Rav Hirschenson's 70th birthday. Fine. Any questions? Okay, so Rav Greenwald then goes on to give a history, perhaps not completely accurate history, of Hungarian Judaism and what happened such that we came to this point of having Orthodox and Reform and these other, and split in the community. Again, this is very much in line with what Rav Greenwald did. He wrote a number of volumes on Jewish history, and this eventually serves, as Adam Fritziger says, this eventually serves as a template for a further volume that he writes on the Hungarian rabbinate. So, okay, so what happens? He goes through the history of the Reform. He talks about how Reform started and how it's spread through like wildfire, the Jews first of Germany and then of Hungary, and that remembering that, again, initially Jews were self-ruled, they were in their own communities, and even after Enlightenment, the government saw each religious community as a community, and those communities were given money from taxes for schools, for synagogues, or whatever places of worship it is, for rabbis. And now you have within any Jewish community those who are Shomrei Torah, as Rav Hirschenson would put it, right? Those who keep Torah, and those who are Mafirei Torah, those who don't keep Torah. And this was a clash, and this caused all sorts of problems amongst the individual communities, again, both in Germany and in Hungary. And so the great rabbis of Hungary, who again is starting with the Chassam Sofer, of course, was the one who first spoke out strongly against the Reform. Maybe I shouldn't say first, but he's the one who spoke out very strongly against the Reform, saying Chadash Asur min Torah, anything new is prohibited from the Torah. Is his students who are the ones who start making these very strong lines between those who are Orthodox and those who are Reform. I'll speak about those a little bit more in a minute. And eventually they decide that they need to split. The communities need to split. It's incorrect to call the Reform and the Orthodox one religious community. They are not. Okay, and this is Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch is the one who pushed this in Germany. It's the students of the Chassam Sofer who pushed this in Hungary. And Rav Greenwald goes through a very touching story about how this happened. So he says at the bottom of page 1, "Ma nedara hi hatumna hazos." How beautiful is this picture? As follows: Gedolei Yisrael yavo b'regesh kodesh lechatzer hamelech. The great ones of Israel come with much feeling to the courtyard of the king. The king is Franz Joseph, okay, the emperor of Hungary. To ask for him, again, and he's purposely using the language of Esther, right? Because she was levakesh lefanav alama, right? They are levakesh lefanav al am hanigash v'hanana, on our people who are now troubled and distraught. And thanks to the great son of the son, S-U-N, of righteousness and the light of the face of the king. Right. So again, the sun is the enlightenment, and this has caused Jews to speak out against their own religion. So harabbanim ha'ele bi'adam k'nei kol Yisrael aleihem nosos. But these rabbis who now come to speak to Franz Joseph, they know that everyone's watching them. Meharayon hazem mishpatam yeitzei im l'shevet im lachas, and they knew that at this interview that they had with Franz Joseph, this would decide whether or not the community could split or not, whether or not, in their minds, Judaism would remain in concert with the laws of the with halacha and with the laws of the Torah or not. Then so they were all prepared. They had their speech set up for Franz Joseph to speak. But what happened? They come before the king. He made the Ma'os Partsu Me'inei Harav Menachem Eisenstadt. So the Menachem Eisenstadt was one of the Rabbanim who came to Franz Joseph. They walk into the king and he starts crying. So Franz Joseph asked, "Madua tabochem? Why are you crying?" So Zakei Nichbad Shalu Hamelach, right? You honorable elder. Why are you crying? The king says. So HaTorah Hakdosha Shavis Machmedenu Yeshiva Zakein. So the elder answered to him that our holy Torah, our what is left to us from our treasures, Rotzim Hayudim Lachmos Meitanu. The Jews want to steal from us. They want to take away from us. Asher Avur HaTorah Hakdosha Pa'amayim Pa'amim Mispar Masru Avosenu Nafsham Aleha. Right, this Torah that our forefathers gave their souls for, that we're willing to die for. Right, all the troubles that we've gone through for our Torah, and now our own brethren are trying to steal away Torah from us and have gone to reform. So the king, Franz Joseph, hears this and he says, not to worry, God forbid there should be and he said, this is how he quotes it, he says, God forbid there should be an inquisition in my land. Of course not. Anyone could follow the religion that they want. Right, so everyone can worship God as they want, and God forbid such a thing should happen, and therefore he agrees to this division, right? And so therefore the Orthodox can break away from the greater Jewish community and form their own communities. Okay, so then he goes on and he talks about all the problems that went on, all the discussions that went on between Hungarian Parliament and what he calls the Hungarian Congress. Okay, so there's so he goes on to talk about this, but at the end of the day, it is successful, and the Jews are given permission. The Orthodox Jews are given permission to split from the reform. So with all that, he says, so he goes on. I want to read everything because already it's getting 10:15. Okay, shouldn't realize. So we're now in the middle. Let's go to the middle of page 2, where he starts Kvodo Kasav. Right, so he says at the beginning of the paragraph. So he says Kvodo Kasav. Right, you, Rabbi Hirschenson, you wrote Im hayu mishtamshim b'shemos ivrim hayu matzlichim lo avin. He says, you shouldn't have used the terms Orthodox and Reform. He says, I don't understand where you're coming from. Hello, Baruch Hashem etzlichu ma'od. He says, I don't understand you. They split, and they were very successful. The Orthodox were very successful. Yesh b'Hungary Torah v'yira. There is currently in Hungary Torah, fear of God, tamimus v'tzidkus. There's purity, there's righteousness. Budapest yesh lechabura hayireim yoser me aseres alafim chavirim kulam shomer Torah shomer Shabbos. We have 10,000 people who guard Shabbos, 10,000 shomer Shabbos in the city of Budapest. Megali b'neim la Torah, who raise their children in Torah. And in all of the great Orthodox communities of Hungary, there are wonderful Jews who are Shomer Torah, who want their kids to grow up and to learn Torah and to be good Jews. So what are you saying? Why are you saying that we haven't succeeded? We have succeeded. The Hungarians did succeed, right? And in fact, why was this split? Why did this split happen? I think I've shown you why. Because after the split, everything was good. Everybody went and did their own thing. Actually, this is part of some of the part that we skipped. Right? Everyone's happy. The Orthodox are happy. They're doing what they want. The Reform are doing whatever they want. The Orthodox have been successful. So what was wrong with this split? This was a good split, right? And in fact, Madua v'halavai sheyasu gam kein po b'artzenu. In fact, we should do the same thing here in America. Let's do this. We should do the same thing. We should split away from the Reform. We should split away from the Conservative. We shouldn't worry about them. We should go off on our own. Right? The Dava Nafshi Barosi, and he says, it pains me, Rabbi Greenwald says, it pains me, Ki Rabbanim Dorshim Bi'alabim Ala Am Yisrael, that there are rabbis who give drashos, who give speeches to their congregation. Asher b'tzocham yireim, that amongst those people there are people who fear God. Levatal anes Chanukah, right? And he said, I've heard they want to annul Chanukah. Right, Rav Echad Yivaker Kol Shavua v'Shavua b'drashasau. And there's one rabbi who every week when he gives his sermon, Yomer b'fer Hesia, he says publicly, Ki Rashi v'Tosos lo yadu. Mad Amru. He says Rashi and Tosos don't understand what they're talking about. This is what a rabbi says. V'chi Rav Kim Pinchas ben Yair commandant. And Rav Pinchas Yair was a I don't know, it's a comedian. He was something, and the whole thing with his donkey. Okay, let's skip over that part. Was not actual. And he says, why are rabbis in America going off and speaking about this? And even, what happens is even if the people in the congregation are good Jews, eventually they hear this apikursus, they hear this minos, they hear this blasphemy, and eventually they themselves are swerved towards reform. And therefore, Greenwald says, not only was it a positive thing to do in Hungary to split, right, and that after the split, everybody lived happily ever after, in fact, we should do the same thing here in the United States. Okay, so that's Rav Greenwald's contention. And that's why he's so upset with Rav Hirschenson. So the truth, of course, is that it's not quite as beautiful as Rav Greenwald makes it out to be. And again, you can see in Rav Greenwald, you can see the way he's thinking. And again, this is not to speak ill of Rav Greenwald at all, but even if you took every single word that he said at face value, right? Maybe everyone did live happily ever after, except for the Reform, who we've totally abandoned, right? So even if you're going to say that everything was fine amongst the Orthodox, but we left our brethren completely behind. And Rav Hirschenson would be the first one to point that out. But furthermore, it's not exactly true that everyone lived happily ever after in Orthodox, even amongst the Orthodox in Hungary. Here I'm reading from this excellent book about Rav Israel Hildesheimer. It's called Rav Israel Hildesheimer and the Creation of Modern Jewish Orthodoxy. This was written by David Ellenson, who's the president of UAHC. And all of David Ellenson's books are excellent. But this one on Rav Israel Hildesheimer is like a must read for anyone who's interested in modern Orthodoxy. I mean, this is like the book. The fact that Rav Ellenson himself is not modern Orthodox or Orthodox at all is irrelevant to the fact that he wrote an excellent piece of work here, that he was thanked very highly by Rav Hildesheimer's family. But in this book, David Ellenson talks about the troubles and the strife that came between Rav Hildesheimer himself and the students of the Chassam Sofer, and talks about some of the rules that they made in order to separate Reform from Orthodox. And he says, so I'm going to read a little bit here. There's the open and extreme hostility between Hildesheimer and the Orthodox leadership in Hungary emerged fully in 1866, when Hildesheimer publicly criticized the Orthodox rabbinate of Hungary for resolutions they had passed at an assembly convened in Mihalowitz earlier that year. Okay, so Rav Hillel Lichtenstein, who was one of the students of the Chassam Sofer, and his group passed nine laws, effectively laws, saying if you follow these laws, you're Orthodox. If you don't follow these laws, you're Reform. And it's interesting to note that it wasn't only Rav Hildesheimer who didn't agree with this, but three great Rabbanim of Hungary themselves didn't, right? And perhaps three of the greatest Rabbanim, including Rav Shmuel Sofer, who is the son of the Chassam Sofer, the Maharam Shik, again, who was one of the great Rabbanim of that time of Hungary, Rav Avram David Deutsch, didn't sign on to these. They themselves didn't sign on to these rules, perhaps showing how extreme Hungary went. But these rules include a complete condemnation of a rabbi speaking in the vernacular. You had to speak in Yiddish, right? If you got up and you spoke in Hungarian or you spoke, God forbid, in German, you were out. You were not Orthodox anymore, right? If the bima wasn't in the center of the show, that was then you're not allowed to walk in. That's what they said. You're not allowed to walk into the shul if the bima is not in the center. If the bima was moved to the front, right? And it goes on. Okay, so some of these, as we'll see, separate seating and the like, where Hildesheimer and presumably the other Rabbanim in Hungary completely agreed with. But some of them, it's as if they were making it up. I mean, imagine you could say this is actually you could say, because there have been Rabbanim who said this. You have to walk out whenever you hear the rabbi speak in the vernacular. Okay, good. So everybody would have walked out of all our shows, right? Maybe it would be easier. You can convince the rabbi not to give speeches anymore if you're not into speeches. But Rabbi real Hildesheimer says to them, like, what are you talking about? You're making up rules out of thin air. Where are you coming from? So and the Hungarian Orthodoxy was losing people. It wasn't like that all of their kids stayed completely from Rahman al-Islam. So again, Rav Greenwald, looking back towards his origins and his youth, is thinking very highly of Hungary and the Jewish community in Hungary. And okay, we understand where he's coming from. Everybody should look positively back on their youth, but it's not quite as rosy as he here makes it out to be. Nonetheless, we would be amiss to say that there weren't great rabbis in Hungary. There certainly were. And they did decide that they should split from the greater community, and they did they did still produce great rabbanim. So and so that is the impasse. Okay, so Greenwald again comes to praise the rabbis in Hungary, saying so much that in fact we should do the same thing here in the United States. And this is where things become important on a practical level, right? Should we actually split with the non-Orthodox? Okay, so Rav Hirschenson, of course, being Rav Hirschenson, would never allow any letter, certainly not a letter like this, to hold him down, and of course he replies. So let's go from the bottom of page 2. Okay, and Rav Hirschenson, let me just say, Rav Hirschenson's basic point, his most basic point to Rav Greenwald is, listen, I disagree very strongly with the Hungarian rabbinate. However, it doesn't mean that I hate them, and that's his main point. You can have an argument, you can have a strong argument, you can have perhaps an integral argument, and disagree on something that is vital to Judaism, but still be friends, right, and still get along. And just because I spoke negatively about the Hungarian rabbinate doesn't mean, God forbid, I hate any single one and any individual in the Hungarian rabbinate. In fact, quite the opposite. Said I was very friendly with members of the Hungarian rabbinate when I was in Israel. Okay, so that was his point number 1. And then his point number 2 is that he's not accusing the Hungarian rabbinate of doing the wrong thing, right? Or I shouldn't say that. He's not accusing the Hungarian rabbinate of doing things for nefarious reasons, right? He says he completely believes that the Hungarian rabbinate did the best they could in the circumstances that they were in. They did what they thought was right. However, even doing what you think is right, and many times even doing the thing that is right, doesn't mean that you don't have negative consequences. And so that's what he says, for example, about the language. He says, you're right. It's not the Hungarian rabbinate that made up the terms Orthodox and Reform. Of course they didn't. They were non-Jewish terms. But you had to go to the non-Jewish king, and the king had to write something, and the king wasn't going to write, those who keep Torah and those who disgrace Torah. That would never happen. So the king had to write Orthodox and Reform. The Congress had to write Orthodox and Reform. And because of that, the language spread amongst the Jewish people. So it's true that the Orthodox rabbinate didn't want those terms to be, they didn't suggest that those terms be used, but the actions of the Orthodox rabbinate led to those terms to be used, and that is a negative. Okay? Again, not that's necessarily their fault, but it's still a negative. There was no thinking ahead. And again, he says, once you start splitting, once you start divisiveness within a community, divisiveness feeds upon itself, right? And you can argue, and Rav Hirschenson doesn't, but you could argue that they did the total right thing in separating, right? But you've now inculcated within your worldview separateness and divisiveness. And that is a negative that perhaps was not foreseen by the rabbis of the time of this initial split between Orthodox and Reform. Okay, so that's effectively how Rav Hirschenson is going to answer. So let's okay, so let's take a look at the first paragraph. He goes to this one is unfortunately tragic. Let's take a look on the bottom of page 2. So kvodomar right. So you've demonstrated shepirud hakitos lekilos miuchados mitzad hamamshala b'Hungaria hayadvar hachrechi. So you, Rav Greenwald, Rav Hirschenson is writing to Rav Greenwald, says you have said that it was necessary to split the community in Hungary. Betzlomar shechachmei Yisrael hayu muchrachim lishtadel. This was the only way to keep Judaism alive. Okay? So he says, I totally agree that this is what the Orthodox rabbin in Hungary felt. I totally agree with that. And I wrote that there's no doubt that they did this l'shem shemayim for the sake of heaven. However, this does not contradict facts, which is that because of this, even Jews, even Hungarian Jews who now live in Israel, believe in such divisiveness. Right? The moment the Hungarians started coming to Israel, and it's come to the point, this horrible issue, he says, Nora and awesome, but it isn't awesomely bad. That they are trying to get the government, again, the English government, right, is pre-state, to cause troubles, to cause, again, divisiveness between wonderfully righteous people, and to violate lotus godedu, not to make separate camps. And especially, right, what they've done to the great, strong priest, right, to the God on high, Tzaddikim Mefursam, the great rabbi, Rav Avram Yitzchak Kook, Shlita, right, Rav Kook, Divrei Sheker, Uvala, who lakshav so kofer b'torah chas v'shalom, right? He says the Hungarians spoke lies and fabrications about Rav Kook and have treated him as if, God forbid, he was a denier of Torah. Rav Kook, of course, was a great Zionist, and Hungarians were not Zionists. So how can you do such a thing? Rav Kook was a great individual who, anyone who spoke to him had only positive things to say. Now, as you know, Rav Hirschenson himself disagreed with Rav Kook on halakhic issues, and we have that. We've spoken about it. Rav Kook didn't believe in women's suffrage. Rav Hirschenson was not into that at all. But to speak out against Rav Kook, that the Hungarians can say Rav Kook is a kofar, how can you even think such a thing? Right? So so it's true that the original rabbis in Hungary, when they did this for the sake of heaven. And I agree that they thought that this was the only way to keep Judaism alive. Right, but this doesn't change what flows from that. Right, what came out of that? These horrible breaks, these horrible divisions that have been caused, whether they've been done by accident or on purpose. Right, sivui harofim hayalachtoches raglo. It's like if the doctor said to cut off someone's leg, they have to do some what's the right word? Thank you. They have to amputate. Thank you. So hayomasim v'hechrech l'shem shemayim. So good. So that's l'shem shemayim. So you amputate when you need to amputate, right? But you don't keep amputating, right? Aval lahara krucha lo chashashu, lo higishu. But they didn't understand, they didn't see, they didn't realize what would happen about the negative causes of this split. That this would just keep causing more and more divisiveness that they didn't realize. Okay, so that is and then he said the same thing about, again, right? So that's about that's with respect to the divisiveness itself, and again, he calls out specifically the attacks on Rav Kook, and then he says the same thing about the Orthodox and Reform, the fact that they had to go to the king caused these to become colloquial, and then look, and now then he starts attacking Rav Greenwald. Now he doesn't attack Rav Greenwald again. He attacks what Rav Greenwald said, that about how after the split everything was just fine. Everyone lives happily ever after. He says not quite so. So let's go back one. Oh, okay, well, okay, let's go to page 3. Oh man, I didn't even put page numbers. I apologize. Let's go to page 3. The paragraph that starts Umasha Kasav Kvodo. Okay, and this is the one that has a left column on it. It says Umasha Kasav Kvodo, and that which you, your honorable one, wrote. Kime aznis pardo hakisos vakilos Hungaria. That the moment that there was this split in the congregations of Hungary, right? Shalom v'shavah b'chol ir v'ir. Right, there is peace and serenity in every city. Yilech ish b'shem Elokav, because everyone is able to go with their own God. It says shachach kvodo ki vishalom omer l'niftar min hamikz. Okay, so he's got it out. So he's going to play on the Gemara here. Okay, because Rev Greenwald used the word. Everyone sits bishalom. Okay, everyone sits bishalom v'shalva. That is the wrong terminology. Okay, why is it the wrong terminology? So if you look on the left-hand column there, this inset, the Gemara tells us in Brachos, Amar of Avin Halevi, Hanifter Mechaviro, someone who departs from his friend, right? You have to say goodbye. Al Yomer lo lech bishalom. Don't say lech bishalom with the bays, right? Don't say go in peace. Ela lech lishalom. Because you should say go to peace. Okay, why? Yisro she'amar lo leMoshe lech lishalom. Right, Yisro, right, Moshe's father-in-law, said to him, lech lishalom, go to peace. Alav hitzliach, and Moshe was successful. David she'amar lo leAvshalom lech bishalom, but David, King David, who said to his son Avshalom, right, go in peace. Halach v'nislach. What happens to Avshalom? He's hung. He's hanged. Sorry, he's hanged. So don't say lech bishalom. You say lech lishalom. Go to peace. The Amar of Avin Halevi hanifter min ameis al yomer lo lech lishalom. However, God forbid someone goes to a funeral, so then you don't say to the casket, you don't say when you leave the cemetery, you don't say lech lishalom ela lech bishalom. So then you say go in peace. Shene'amar v'atata v'lavasecha bishalom. Right? That Hashem says that you will rest with your forefathers, Yaakov Avinu, that you will go in peace. Okay, so Rav Hirschenson now picks on again. He's being picky here in terms of the language, but he's trying to make a point. He said, "You, Rav Greenwald, you use this. You said from that moment on, everyone sat bishalom. Everyone went in peace. But we're not talking about dead people here, right? If you were talking about a basic varos, if you're talking about a cemetery, then you should say lech bishalom, right? But you should have said lech lishalom. But what's the point, right? So." Shachach kvodo bishalom omrim leniftar min hamei. So bishalom is used when you leave a cemetery. But niftar min hachai tzarich lomer lech lishalom. But one who leaves their friend should say go to peace, right? Lishalom hamispatech umisrabeh, right? That you should increase in peace. Right? Umeachar kol hapradim umoshecha elav ke'evan asher eves es kol hakudos hamufurzeros el merkaz achat. So what should have happened is that there were all these splits, but then there should have been, as it were, a magnet that can gather together all of the different pieces, right, and bring them back together. That would be lech lishalom. That's what it should be. Lo hashalom hamafrido sam ka'atzamos hamfuzeros sapanei hasadeh. Right? We don't want peace where every corpse is lying in its own plot. Right? Yeah, they're all at peace too, but you know what? They're all separate. Right? That's not the peace that we want. Right? Right? Again, he's borrowing now from Ezekiel, right? From the great vision of Ezekiel and the Valley of Bones, right? Will these bones live? Right? Now that you've left them on their own to rot, right? Are they ever going to live again, separated in each one in its own in its own coffin? And all the negative that you see in reform, and what people even see more than you see, right? Maybe that all occurred because we pushed them away too strong. Maybe that's why it happens. Maybe that's why they're so far off the derech, right? Because we pushed them down and we didn't bring them up, right? And now we see that this in fact is true. Why? Because one of the major changes of the reform, right, in the 1885 in the Pittsburgh platform, right, what was it? That we are not hoping for a return to Zion, right? They took out all return from Zion and from their prayers. They took out all sacrifices from their prayers. That's what the reform did. That was the major platform, right? There's a major plank in their platform, right? But what happened? It all changed, right? Now they're being healed from it, right? Right? Reform is coming back because they see the need for Zionism, right? And it's bringing them back towards Judaism, and that is the way to do it. Zionism doesn't, as he says, Zionism doesn't throw a rock down on them after they've fallen, right? Zion brings with peace and with serenity. Right? That's what we should have done. Maybe all the negative that's come about from reform is because we pushed them away too hard. Right? So again, that's a very a very strong statement by Rav Hirschenson. And then he goes further. Okay, and then he makes a couple of points. He says the language that we've used, and in fact, this is exactly what Greenwald said in here. The language that we use is bad because once someone is labeled Orthodox, it's hard to escape, right? So someone could be Orthodox and then have Reformed views that everybody says, oh, it must be okay because he is Orthodox, right? And so the label becomes a gate, and it's hard to get out of the gate, right? And that's what he says. And he said there are rabbis in America who are Orthodox or conservative, you can call themselves whatever it is, but they espouse blasphemous views, but everybody's okay with it because they call themselves Orthodox, right? And so that's why we shouldn't have such names. What we should have names is, what we should have is, does this person agree with Torah or does this person not agree with Torah? And there's no groups, and it's not a group. It's not a clan, right? It's a, do you agree? Do you believe in Torah or not? That's how things should be, right? And then he says, and by the way, I should tell you, let me tell you a little bit about Frankfurt. And Rav Greenwald had written a whole thing about the greatness of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, which of course Rav Hirschenson agrees to. But he says that, but let me tell you that it's not quite what Rav Hirsch thought. So Kvodo Kasav She'einen, this is towards the bottom of page 3, second to last paragraph. Kvodo Kasav, right? So you wrote, She'einen ro'eh shum takala b'pirud hakihilos be'eretz Yisrael. So you don't see any problem with this split with split of different congregations in oh no, that's not the one I wanted. I'm sorry, I wanted the one before that. The third class paragraph. Advar hamatzah b'Frankfurt on mine. Right. So with respect to the community in Frankfurt, there's another shul in Frankfurt. There's not just Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. It's another shul in Frankfurt. Who is it? I shared Dr. Horowitz. Zatzal, Kohen Lerav, Vav Bezdin Ba. It's led by Dr. Horowitz, who now I'm blanking on the name of the sefer that he wrote, but he's also a great Talmud Chacham. And he didn't separate. He's still part of the greater community in Frankfurt. And they're bigger Talmidei Chachamim, right? Bigger people who fear God, and Rav Horowitz's shul than Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's shul. But there are less, Hasidim who don't know anything, right? There are less people who consider themselves fearing of sin who are in fact ignoramuses. Right? Shimshon Raphael Hirsch Zatzal Pal Harbi Linto Yiras Hashem Frankfurt. Right? Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch did amazing and wonderful things in order to plant fear of God in Frankfurt. No one could disagree with that. Via his wonderful sermons and his interesting and exciting writings, right? But his greatness did not come about because of the split. And if he hadn't split, then more people would have been able to hear him. Right? More people would have been able to read what he wrote. Because they wouldn't have said he's not one of us.
How are you?
They wouldn't have said that he is
sleep nicely?
Hey,
good.
Okay, hold on. Somebody is. I'm gonna.
Your son.
Mute that. There we go. Okay. So again, so that's his take. Again, is it true? Is he right? I don't know. Maybe he is. Maybe he isn't. It's hard to tell. Is Rav Greenwald right? I don't know. Maybe it's likely somewhere in the middle. right? That's probably where it is. But again, we see the two sides. Rav Greenwald saying no, the split was necessary, and after the split, everything was good. And Rav Hirschenson is saying no, the split was a mistake, right? And because of that, we pushed them too hard, and they're in this horrible situation where they are perhaps because of some of what we've done. And so that is the clash here, and that is then the question of what do you do in the United States. And again, Rav Greenwald kind of gives it up because he himself then goes on to speak about things like George Washington and the Jews and the Merchant of Venice and speaks to professors and all sorts of things that no real student of the Chassam Sofer would ever do. But the argument that he's making here, we understand where he's coming from. Again, this is his heritage. This is where he came from. Okay, in the bottom of page 3, I included one paragraph, not because Rav Hirschenson spoke about it, not because Rav Greenwald spoke about it too much, but it's worth noting. The quote of Rav Chernowitz, who Rav Greenwald described as the right-hand man of Stephen Wise. So again, Stephen Wise, not to be confused with Meir Wise. Stephen Wise started, I think it was called the Jewish Institute of, because now it's HUHCJIR, right? Is that what it is? So JIR was started by Stephen Wise, and eventually they came together. Again, Wise was without question a reformer, and this Rav Chernowitz, who was a Talmud Chacham and Orthodox rabbi, went to work at his he calls it a college and a school for preachers. Okay, that's interesting. Interesting nomenclature. So, and Rav Greenwald talks about how horrible it is. And Rav Hirschenson says, listen, this Rav Chernowitz, what should have happened is he should have gone to YU. He says it explicitly. He says YU should have hired him, but they didn't. I don't know why he didn't hire him. So Rabbi Wise, saw this Rav Chernowitz, who's a great individual, and felt, and he says Stephen Wise loves Talmidei Chachamim. Interesting point, Rabbi Hirschenson, and so he hired him to work at his college. What do you want from the guy? This person, this Rav Chernowitz, is doing whatever he can to put Yiras Shamayim and Yiras Chait, right? Put fear of heaven and fear of God and fear of sin into the Reform College. So why are you dumping on him? Right? This is what people have to do, and at least they're saving whatever, and they're saving whatever they can. Okay, so let's just going then to the last paragraph. He says, "Akavesh acharei divrei ela." So he says, I hope that after my words here, Yavin Kvodo, that you, Honorable One, will understand. It's not because of any hatred that I have for the wise men of for the rabbis of Hungary that have written this. And such a wise individual such as yourself, you need to understand that disagreements in thought are not disagreements in heart. And people who really seek knowledge, right, who truly seek knowledge, can still be true friends, even if they have different views. In order to fulfill the verse, right, that you should love peace and truth. And both of those can go together. And even if you disagree with someone, that's what he's saying. Even if you disagree with someone on what truth is, it doesn't mean that you can't be shalom and ahev. And so that's how Rav Hirschenson ends off. And as I mentioned earlier, it seems to have worked. Rav Greenwald and Rav Hirschenson. Again, Rav Hirschenson was a lot older than Rav Greenwald. He passed away way before Rav Greenwald. But they seem to have been able to keep up a strong personal connection, and of course that should be a model for all of us here in the Jewish community. So I'll stop there. I hope this has served also as a bit of an introduction to Rav Greenwald. Of course, we've had the opportunity to speak to her about Rav Hirschenson in the past, but it's always worth revisiting such a interesting rabbi, and of course one whose rabbinate was not too far from where we are here in New Jersey. And even though, of course, it's many years later, 80, 90 years later, from 1928, we still can understand what things were like in the Jewish community of New Jersey so long ago. So happy Independence Day, everybody! And of course, we're happy to take any questions. But well, that's the official end for the moment.